Attack in 2 stages on 2 separate nights. On the first night, his offensive would sweep from north to south, a 3-pronged attack on the Argentinians. Moore planned to take this outer ring of hills, the largest of which was Mount Longdon in the north here. On the second night, the British would assault another ring of hills nearer Stanley, centred here on Mount Tumbledown. Success would leave them just 2 miles from Stanley. The first targets were the Argentinian troops dug in all over Mount Longdon. Mount Longdon is a natural fortress. Over 500 feet at its highest point, it dominates the surrounding moorland. For the British forces, this was a dangerous place to attack. And after their experiences at Goose Green, they didn't want their troops caught advancing in the open terrain in daylight. So they made a key decision. All the battles to retake Stanley would be fought at night.
Night fighting is a highly effective strategy. Every soldier in the British forces has to be as good at fighting in the dark as in daylight. I joined the British Army on a training exercise to experience what it's like. The attack began with flares and machine gun fire once we'd crept as close as we could in the pitch dark. It's incredibly noisy and it's actually quite bewildering. Just moving around in these conditions is very difficult. You're weighed down by your equipment. There's people tripping over, falling in the frozen stream and turning ankles. The enemy is not the only challenge in this dark and difficult terrain. Despite how hard it is to operate in the dark, it's imperative that the attacking troops don't get pinned down.
At the moment, the most important thing is we've got to begin our attack. We've got to keep up the momentum, keep up the speed, and I guess keep the enemy off balance. We're about to go over this rise now, and interestingly, the commander here is constantly telling everyone what's going on in the rest of the battlefield. Even though it's only 50 or 100 metres away, it's very confusing in the dark. We can just hear firing and lots of shouting. So he's constantly going around telling everyone what stage we're at, trying to keep everything going to plan.
For the British troops on the Falklands, keeping to the plan and maintaining momentum would be the key to their success when fighting at night. At 8 p.m. on the 11th of June, the British forces began their attack on Mount Longdon. But 3 para who were spearheading the advance found themselves trapped in a bewildering maze of steep-sided alleyways.
These narrow gullies here channeled the men into the killing grounds of the Argentinian machine gunners and snipers up above. Then grenades were rolled down in amongst them. One officer compared it to like being stuck in a bowling alley.
The grenades, they were just bouncing down the side of the rock face. We thought there were rocks falling, till the first one exploded.
Despite mounting casualties, the men pushed forward. One sergeant, Ian Mackay, dashed up a slope and knocked out a stubborn Argentinian position. He was killed, but later awarded the Victoria Cross. For 7 hours, the British forces battled their way up Mount Longdon. Their assault was just too forceful for the Argentinians to hold off.
So desperate were the Argentinians to smash the British attack that Menendez risked his own men's lives by ordering his own artillery to bring down fire on their own positions here on Mount Longdon. But it didn't do any good. By 6:30 a.m., the British had captured the mountain.
As day broke, the British brought in the dead and injured from both sides. Most of the Argentinian casualties and prisoners were conscript soldiers, young men drafted into the army. While these soldiers had fought well, many of them were worn down by the conditions before the battle had begun. Some of them were even captured in their positions, like this one, huddled up in their sleeping bags trying to escape the battle and the cold.
I am tired, cold, unhappy. I swear that I can't take it anymore, even though this is my duty as a man and a soldier of the fatherland.
Although this had been a bloody battle for both sides, the British attacks had taken all the high ground they'd planned to on the first night. But another night's fighting still lay ahead.
Of the remaining mountains that had to be captured on the second night, by far the most vital was that one over there. That's Tumbledown, the last major obstacle between the British and Stanley.
The men charged with recapturing Tumbledown were the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guards. Just 8 weeks earlier, they'd been on ceremonial duties like guarding Buckingham Palace. This would be the first experience of war for many of them, and they now had to confront perhaps the toughest target of the campaign. If the Argentinians lost Tumbledown, they lost Stanley. So they'd put their best men up here, the elite 5th Marines. 700 heavily armed, crack troops were dug into the protected positions in the caves and rocks high on the mountain. These Argentinian Marines had been trained to fight at night, and they outnumbered the attacking British forces by almost 2 to 1. The Argentinians were confident they could hold the British off. As soon as darkness fell, the fighting began.
Aye, it was murder. We were coming under mortar fire, machine gun fire, sniper fire. You name it, it was coming towards us. Well, there's a saying, expect the unexpected. And that was unexpected. You cannot really describe it. Nobody could describe it if they've not been there.
3 hours into the battle, things were going badly for the British. The Scots Guards' attack had come to a complete halt.
They were taunting us, the odd word in English, calling us to come on, and I think they mentioned surrender. The combination of cold, uncertainty and the general awareness that we were stuck led to the group ego shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. At that stage I thought we had blown it.
That's Mount Tumbledown behind me up there. And here it is on the map case. The Scots Guards had approached Tumbledown from the west and made their way up this slope here unopposed. But now one company, about 120 men, were pinned down here by stiff opposition from the Argentinians positioned in the rocks and crags up above, on top of the ridge here.
Then 30 Scots Guards climbed up onto higher ground to the north, undetected by the Argentinians down below. Now they were able to bring sustained fire down on the Argentinians' exposed flank. The rest of the company stormed the Argentinian strongpoint. The Scots had made the breakthrough.
As dawn broke, the battle was still raging on Tumbledown, and the British forces prepared to throw everything they had into the fight for Stanley. They hammered the remaining enemy positions in a final all-out bombardment. Soon Argentinian troops could be seen fleeing. The British troops had effectively destroyed their enemy's will to fight, and the Argentinians retreated, flooding back into Stanley in their hundreds. The Argentinian resistance was crumbling. As the demoralized defenders poured into Stanley, the men were heard arguing with their superiors. Discipline among the Argentinian troops was breaking down. It wasn't long before they were surrounded.
And on the 14th of June, the British demanded the Argentinian surrender. Realizing that he had little choice, Menendez accepted. After 2.5 months, the battle for the Falklands was over.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The Argentinians had occupied Stanley for 74 days. But now, as two para marched into the capital, it was back in British hands.
A month later, the first British troops arrived back home to jubilant celebrations. This victory had given people a renewed sense of pride in their country and a feeling that Britain could lift itself out of its recent decline.
And riding on the crest of this success was Margaret Thatcher. Within a year, she won the general election with a resounding majority. The Iron Lady had cemented her position as a major world leader.
In Argentina, the news of the surrender was taken very badly. Far from uniting the people, the war had left the Argentinians furious at the army and the government.
Just 3 days after Argentina's defeat, Galtieri was forced from power and military rule collapsed in Argentina.
Over in the Falklands, the legacy of this bitter conflict lives on. Nearly 1,000 people died in the war, 252 British servicemen, 3 Falkland Islanders, and almost 700 Argentinians. After the war, the British government offered to return the bodies of the Argentinian dead to Argentina for burial, but their government refused. They said that these islands were part of Argentina and the bodies would remain here. For the Falkland Islanders, these graves are a daily reminder that Argentina refuses to drop its claim to their homeland.
After the war ended, Britain greatly increased its permanent military presence on the islands. Now there's 1 serviceman for every 2 civilians living here. Today the islanders are still determined the Falklands remain British. As long as Britain continues to respect their wishes, there'll be no early end to this bitter territorial dispute.